Yesterday, I was reading a newspaper. Not reading, just skimming. You know how it is. Markets, conflicts, experts sounding very confident about things that might collapse by evening. And then, something felt off. Because none of it was physical. No factories moving, no mountains shifting. Yet, people were panicking. Governments reacting, money changing direction. Later that day, I spoke to a marketing psychologist. I told him it felt like the world was running on ideas, not reality. He didn't hesitate. He said very calmly, "That's because it is." I remember saying, no, that can't be right. I mean, money is paper. Brands are logos. Value is supposed to be real. He smiled. Not in a smug way, more like he'd heard this before. He said perception is the most real thing humans respond to. That line stayed with me. I pushed back. I said surely logic has to be running things somewhere. He said logic is great at explaining the past, but terrible at inventing the future. He said that's why new ideas feel uncomfortable. Not wrong, uncomfortable. And the brain hates discomfort. We talked about how quickly people reject unfamiliar thoughts. How fast we say, that doesn't make sense, and walk away. He said that reaction isn't intelligence, it's protection. The brain evolved to keep us safe, not curious. New ideas introduce instability, and instability feels dangerous. So we laugh. We mock. We dismiss. Because ridicule is easier than admitting the world might change. That's when I mentioned alchemy. The word itself feels embarrassing, doesn't it? Old men, dusty books, lead into gold. But he said alchemy wasn't stupidity. It was rebellion. At a time when people believed reality was fixed, alchemists said, no, this can change. Matter, the self, limits. That belief alone was radical. Of course they failed. No gold, no immortality. I brought that up. He agreed. Then he paused, just long enough to make it uncomfortable. And he said, failure isn't the same as uselessness. Alchemy failed at outcomes, but succeeded at something far more dangerous. It trained imagination. It taught humanity to experiment, to believe transformation was possible before understanding how, before proof. That's when the conversation drifted into marketing. He said something that made me laugh out loud. He said marketing is modern alchemy. I said, come on. He said, think about it. We don't sell products. We sell meaning, identity, status, belonging. If humans were logical, advertising wouldn't exist. But it does. Because humans don't buy what makes sense. They buy what feels right. And suddenly, the pattern was everywhere. Money works because we believe it does. Brands matter because we agree they matter. Even fear spreads faster as a story than a fact. The world isn't built on logic. It's built on belief. Airplanes once sounded ridiculous. Germs sounded insane. Electricity was magic. Now they're obvious. So, maybe the real question isn't why alchemists believed strange things. Maybe the real question is, what strange ideas are we rejecting right now that future generations will call obvious? Alchemy never turned lead into gold. But it did something far more important. It taught humanity to imagine change before understanding it. And once you let that idea sit, even for a moment, you realize the experiment never ended. It just changed its name. Now, let's talk about the ideas themselves. You're listening to Wise Alchemy. Let's begin. I remember bringing it up, almost casually. I said I'd been noticing something about myself, about how fast certain ideas get shut down, not argued with, not explored, just closed. An idea appears, and before it even finishes the sentence, something inside me says, no. Not loudly, not aggressively, just a quiet internal rejection. That doesn't make sense. That's unrealistic. That can't be true. I told him it felt efficient, like my brain was doing its job. He listened without interrupting, then said something that immediately slowed me down. He said discomfort comes before understanding. Not sometimes. Almost always. I laughed because that felt backward. We like to believe we understand first and reject later. But he said the brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't ask, is this true? It asks, is this familiar? And if the answer is no, the body reacts. Tension, dismissal, distance. Only later does reasoning arrive to justify what's already been decided. That part caught me off guard. I said, half joking, half serious, so you're saying I didn't think. I reacted. He didn't correct me. He said the brain evolved under pressure, under risk. New ideas once meant new dangers, unknown plants, unfamiliar animals, unpredictable environments. So the brain learned speed over accuracy. Reject first, analyze later if needed. And suddenly, rejection didn't feel like intelligence anymore. It felt like survival. I laughed again, but this time quieter. All those moments I felt clever for dismissing something quickly. I wasn't being smart. I was being fast. And speed isn't wisdom. He said something else that stayed with me. He said certainty is comforting. Uncertainty is exhausting. Sitting with an unfamiliar idea requires energy. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to feel a little lost. And the brain hates feeling lost, so it grabs onto the nearest explanation and calls it truth. That's when I started noticing how often confidence arrives before clarity. How often the feeling of being right comes long before understanding, and how dangerous that feeling can be. Because once certainty settles in, curiosity leaves the room. I admitted something then. I said most of the ideas I've rejected in my life weren't examined. They were filtered. Filtered out by discomfort, by tone, by unfamiliar language, by the quiet fear of being wrong. He said that's not a personal flaw. It's a human one. The mind is not built to discover truth. It's built to preserve stability. Truth is a side effect, not the goal. That reframed everything. Because if rejection happens before thinking, then dismissing an idea tells you nothing about its accuracy. It only tells you how unfamiliar it feels. And that leads to a disturbing question. If the brain says no before it ever asks, is it true? How many powerful ideas never get a chance to speak? How many transformations die quietly at the moment of discomfort? Once you see this, you can't unsee it. You start noticing your own reactions, the tightening, the instant labeling, and for the first time, you hesitate. Not to believe the idea, not to reject it, but to hold it, just long enough to ask the question that usually comes too late. What if this feels wrong because it's new, not because it's false? That question alone is enough to make certainty feel suspicious. And that suspicion might be the beginning of intelligence. At some point, I pushed back. Not aggressively, just instinctively. I said all of this was interesting, but surely logic had to be our safeguard. I mean, um, without logic, how do we tell good ideas from bad ones? How do we avoid believing everything? He didn't rush to answer. He said logic is essential, just not in the way we worship it. That stopped me, because I did worship it, quietly, unquestioned. Logic felt clean, reliable, safe. He said logic is extraordinary at operating inside a system. Once the rules are known, logic can refine them endlessly. It can optimize processes, improve efficiency, explain outcomes with precision. But, and this was the part that shifted everything, logic cannot create a new system. I remember sitting there, letting that sentence land. Because if that was true, then logic wasn't the beginning of progress. It was the middle. He explained that logic always starts with assumptions, known variables, established boundaries. The future doesn't arrive with assumptions. It arrives as a violation. That made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it felt uncomfortably accurate. He asked me to think of any idea that genuinely changed the world. Flying, electricity, evolution, invisible germs. Each one sounded ridiculous when first proposed, not to fools, to the most logical minds of their time. Based on everything people knew, these ideas weren't just unlikely, they were impossible. That's when I felt something shift. Because logic didn't fail those ideas, logic rejected them correctly, according to the information available. Which means something unsettling follows. If logic depends on what is already known, then anything truly new will always look illogical at first. Not because it's false, but because it doesn't belong yet. I said that sounded dangerous. He agreed immediately. Progress is dangerous. But he said avoiding danger also avoids evolution. Pure rationality produces stable worlds. Stable worlds repeat themselves. They get efficient, but not new. That word repeat stuck with me, because repetition feels like success until you realize nothing is changing. He said something then that I can't forget. He said logic explains airplanes beautifully today. Lift, drag, engineering equations. But logic never imagined airplanes. Imagination did. Logic arrived later, once the impossible was already in the sky. I laughed because it felt obvious, and because I'd never seen it that way before. Logic isn't the inventor, it's the translator. It takes what imagination risks and makes it respectable. I started noticing how often we use logic as an escape hatch, as a way to say, this isn't worth engaging with. Logic becomes a polite dismissal, a shield against uncertainty. Because uncertainty is exhausting. It requires staying open without knowing where things lead. And logic offers closure. But closure isn't creation. Creation is messy, awkward, unconvincing. It begins as a hunch, a feeling, an idea that doesn't know how to defend itself yet. Only later does logic step in and clean the story. That's when another uncomfortable thought surfaced. Most of what we call rational thinking is hindsight wearing confidence. We label ideas logical after they succeed. Before that, we call them foolish. By the end of the conversation, something in me softened. I didn't lose respect for logic, but I stopped expecting it to lead the way. Logic, I realized, keeps the lights on, but imagination builds new rooms. And the future, whatever it becomes, has never been invented by reason alone. There was a moment in the conversation when I hesitated, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to say it. I brought up alchemy. Even hearing the word out loud felt strange, like I'd just dragged something unserious into a serious room. Alchemy carries centuries of ridicule, lead into gold, secret symbols, failure dressed up as mystery. I almost apologized for mentioning it. But he didn't react the way I expected. He didn't smile. He didn't dismiss it. He paused. And then he said something that quietly rearranged everything. He said alchemy wasn't ignorance. It was defiance. I remember the silence that followed, the kind of silence where your brain stops rushing and actually listens. Because I'd always assumed alchemists misunderstood science, that they were confused about how the world worked. He said that wasn't true. They understood the world exactly as it was taught to them. They just refused to accept it as final. They lived in an age where matter was believed to be fixed, where the universe was static, where social order felt eternal. And they said, without proof, without permission, no. Matter can change. Humans can change. Destiny might not be permanent. Oh. That belief alone was radical. Not the furnaces, not the strange drawings. The belief. At a time when even questioning the natural order could cost you your life, alchemy dared to imagine transformation. I felt myself nodding slowly, not because I agreed with their methods, but because I finally understood their courage. Alchemy wasn't trying to turn lead into gold because alchemists were foolish. They were asking a larger question. Is reality finished, or is it still becoming? That question sounds harmless now. Back then, it threatened everything. Of course, they failed. I mentioned that. No gold, no immortality, no miracle substances. He didn't argue. Instead, he said something unsettling. He said failure doesn't erase intention. Alchemy failed at outcomes, but succeeded at something more dangerous. It introduced the idea that permanence itself could be challenged. Once that idea exists, even in the wrong form, it doesn't disappear. It waits. For better tools, better language, better timing. That reframed failure entirely. Alchemy wasn't a dead end. It was an early draft, a rough version of a future idea that hadn't learned how to speak clearly yet. I started thinking about how often we judge ideas by their first appearance, how quickly we call something stupid because it arrives unpolished, as if truth is supposed to be elegant from birth. Alchemy didn't have equations. It didn't have microscopes. It didn't have modern chemistry. It had imagination. And imagination was enough to unsettle the world. By the time the thought settled, something unexpected happened. I felt sympathy. Not just for alchemists, but for ideas themselves. Ideas that arrive too early. Ideas that don't yet know how to defend themselves. Ideas that are right in spirit, but wrong in form. Progress, I realized, rarely begins with clarity. It begins with refusal. Refusal to accept the rules as final. And maybe that's why society laughs, because defiance, before it learns to explain itself, looks exactly like foolishness. There was a shift in the conversation then. The tone darkened. I asked him something I'd been circling for a while. I asked why new ideas are almost always ridiculed. Not debated, not examined. Ridiculed. There was a pause before he answered. Not hesitation, care. Because once you name this thing, you can't unsee it. He said laughter isn't confidence, it's avoidance. That landed harder than I expected. I'd always assumed ridicule meant superiority, that people laughed because they knew better. But he said laughter is often the brain's fastest escape route. If you laugh at an idea, you don't have to engage with it. You don't have to consider it. You don't have to risk being wrong. You can dismiss it emotionally without touching it intellectually. I felt my shoulders tighten because I could see it. Times I'd laughed things off. Times I'd shared a joke instead of a thought. I started to say something, then stopped. He continued. He said societies don't fear bad ideas. They fear disruptive ones. Ideas that threaten stability are dangerous, even if they're true. So ridicule becomes a social reflex, a way of saying, we're not talking about this. Softly, no, no. That sound came out of me before I realized I was making it. Because once he said it, I could feel how often humor had protected me. Protected me from embarrassment, from uncertainty, from standing alone. Mockery is communal. Curiosity is lonely. That difference matters. He said curiosity requires energy, time, vulnerability. Mockery is cheap. It costs nothing to laugh, nothing to repeat a joke. And jokes spread faster than questions. That's when it became personal. I remembered moments when an idea made me uncomfortable, and instead of asking about it, I smiled, I joked, I moved on. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't want to stand out. He said ridicule keeps groups cohesive. Laugh together, stay safe together. Curiosity, on the other hand, creates friction. It asks people to slow down and tolerate uncertainty. Most groups don't have patience for that. So they laugh, not cruelly, not consciously, reflexively. That's why the first response to a disruptive idea is almost never anger. It's humor. And humor hides fear better than rage ever could. Once that clicked, I started noticing it everywhere, in conversations, in headlines, online. Ideas don't get crushed by arguments first. They get drowned in jokes. That's cheaper. That's safer. That's effective. And the realization that stayed with me was this. Mockery isn't the opposite of belief. It's the opposite of curiosity. And curiosity is expensive. It demands attention, risk, the willingness to be wrong in public. So society laughs and calls it confidence. But underneath the humor, what's really there is fear. Fear of change, fear of instability, fear of discovering that the rules might not be as solid as we thought. The conversation didn't shift suddenly. It drifted. Almost naturally, it moved from ideas and rejection into something more familiar. Marketing. Not the loud kind, not ads or slogans, something quieter. He said something simple at first, that humans don't respond to facts the way we think they do. I nodded without thinking. Facts feel solid, clean, reliable. Then he said meaning arrives before facts do. That slowed me down. I'd always assumed facts created meaning, that if people just had enough information, they'd act rationally. He said the mind doesn't work that way. Humans decide first, then justify. We don't buy products, we buy what those products say about us. Identity, belonging, status. I laughed when he called marketing modern alchemy. It sounded exaggerated, a little theatrical, but then he explained it calmly. Alchemy tried to transform matter through belief, symbols, and process. Marketing does the same thing, just with perception. Different materials, same mechanism. That's when the pattern started forming, slowly. Money, he said, is just paper until belief gives it weight. A brand logo is meaningless ink until enough people agree it stands for something. Even identity works this way. We tell stories about who we are, we repeat them, we defend them, and eventually we live inside them. I started noticing how often meaning moves first. Why people pay more for the same object because of a name. why a story can crash a market faster than data ever could, why fear spreads faster than evidence. He said facts don't disappear, they just arrive late. By the time facts show up, the emotional decision is often already made. That wasn't cynical, it was descriptive. There was a quiet pause after that. Not silence, recognition. Because once you see it, it's everywhere. The world isn't held together by logic alone. It's held together by agreement, shared belief, repeated stories, unquestioned assumptions. Systems come later. Systems exist to support belief, to stabilize it, to protect it, to make it feel permanent. And suddenly something clicked very clearly. Humans don't live inside systems. They live inside stories. Stories about money, stories about success, stories about who matters and who doesn't. Systems are just scaffolding built around those stories. That's when alchemy stopped feeling ancient. It stopped feeling symbolic. It felt current, alive. Because belief was everywhere I looked. Markets moved on confidence. Brands thrived on meaning. Identity itself felt negotiable. Belief wasn't decoration. It wasn't illusion. It was infrastructure. And once that settled in, the earlier chapters lined up differently. Alchemy didn't disappear. It matured. It changed language. And we've been practicing it every single day, without ever calling it that. That conversation stayed with me. Not because he gave me answers, but because he changed the way I was asking questions. It wasn't dramatic, no big revelation, just a quiet shift. The kind where you suddenly notice how many ideas you've been dismissing without ever meeting them. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. So that's the conversation I had. And honestly, it opened my mind. Now, my friend, let's step away from the conversation and talk about the core ideas of this book. December 17, 1903. A cold morning on a narrow stretch of sand in North Carolina. The wind was sharp. The machine looked fragile. The outcome was uncertain. There were no crowds watching, no officials taking notes, no guarantees waiting at the end. Just two brothers standing beside something the world still considered impossible. At that moment, there was no proof that humans could fly. There was only belief. And history rarely pauses long enough to appreciate how much courage that requires. Because before the photographs, before the calculations, before aviation became a branch of engineering, someone had to step forward as if the future were already real. Not because it was proven, but because it was imagined. That's where belief enters the story. Always first. We like to believe progress is careful, that humans gather evidence, weigh options, and move only when certainty arrives. It's a comforting story. It makes the world feel rational, predictable, safe. But history doesn't support it. Again and again, the pattern is the same. Action arrives first, explanation follows. Belief moves the body, proof chases after it. Confidence spreads faster than truth ever has. Not because confidence is correct, but because confidence is contagious. You can see it in crowds, in markets, in movements. One person acts with conviction, others feel that certainty, and suddenly momentum exists where evidence is still incomplete. Belief doesn't need consensus. It only needs direction. This is where things become uncomfortable. Because we've been taught to distrust belief, to treat belief without proof as weakness, as recklessness, as a mistake waiting to happen. And sometimes it is. But what we rarely admit is that nothing transformative begins any other way. No major shift in human history waited patiently for permission. Someone always moved early, often too early, often mocked, often wrong about the details, but right about the direction. And only after movement began did proof arrive to explain why it worked. Think about how often proof arrives late. Proof doesn't lead revolutions, it documents them. Proof doesn't invent the future, it makes the future stable. It turns risk into method, guesswork into systems, belief into textbooks. But belief is what steps forward without knowing the ending. This is why belief looks irresponsible from the outside. Why early believers are accused of being naive or dangerous or unrealistic. Waiting for certainty feels wise, but waiting keeps everything exactly where it is. Belief accepts risk because it senses possibility. And possibility, even without evidence, is enough to begin movement. Alchemy understood this instinctively. Believing that matter is not finished, that systems are not permanent, that identity itself might be negotiable. Alchemy didn't wait for permission to imagine change. It moved first. And even when it failed, it left something behind, a habit of belief, a willingness to act before certainty arrived. That habit still runs the world. Every major shift begins the same way. Someone behaves as if the future is already possible. Not guaranteed, not safe, possible. And once movement starts, proof scrambles to catch up, trying to explain what belief has already set in motion. So belief is not irrational, it's directional. It points toward what does not yet exist. Proof follows because it must, because once belief moves the world, reality has no choice but to respond. Next, we step deeper. Because belief doesn't just start action. Sometimes it reshapes outcomes themselves. That's where we go next. There's a comforting belief we like to hold, that the world is neutral, that reality simply is, that it waits patiently while we observe it. But the more I thought about belief, the harder that idea became to defend. Because belief doesn't just start action. Sometimes it changes what happens next. Expectation doesn't sit quietly in the mind. It leaks into perception, into behavior, into outcomes. And once you notice that, the separation between observer and world starts to feel less solid. Think about how two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different realities. Same event, same facts, different outcomes. One sees opportunity, another sees threat. One performs well under pressure, another collapses. The difference isn't intelligence, it isn't effort, it's expectation. What you expect quietly shapes what you notice, how you react, and what you allow yourself to attempt. That makes sense. Expectation narrows attention. It highlights certain signals and ignores others. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you expect it to behave. This is where the idea becomes uncomfortable. Because if expectation shapes perception, and perception shapes action, then belief is already influencing reality before anything external changes. The mind doesn't just interpret experience, it participates in it. That doesn't mean belief controls everything. It doesn't mean reality bends on command. But it does mean reality is not passive. It responds. Subtly, incrementally, relentlessly. People who expect improvement notice paths others overlook. People who expect failure hesitate at moments that require movement. Those small differences compound. Over time, expectation becomes outcome. This is why confidence often looks like talent. why belief can appear indistinguishable from ability. Not because belief replaces skill, but because belief allows skill to surface. Doubt interrupts, expectation enables, and the world reacts accordingly. Once you see this pattern, the idea of a neutral observer begins to dissolve. You are always involved. Your expectations shape your choices. Your choices shape the environment you move through. That environment feeds back into belief. A loop. A quiet one. Alchemy hinted at this long before psychology had language for it. It wasn't just about changing matter. It was about the relationship between mind and world. The belief that transformation was possible changed how alchemists experimented, how they interpreted failure, how long they persisted. Expectation didn't guarantee success, but it altered the trajectory. It kept the process alive. This is why belief can feel dangerous, because it means responsibility. If expectation participates in outcomes, then we are not just victims of circumstance. We are contributors. Not in a dramatic, all-powerful way, but in a constant, accumulating one. That makes sense. The observer is never separate from the outcome. You don't stand outside reality. You lean into it, and it leans back. Once that settles in, belief stops feeling abstract. It becomes structural, a force that quietly shapes what becomes possible, what becomes visible, and what becomes real. And that raises a deeper question. If belief influences outcomes and timing determines survival, then what happens when the right idea arrives at the wrong moment? That's where we go next. There's a quiet assumption we grow up with, that if an idea is true, it will eventually win. That truth has gravity, that correctness is enough. But history is far less fair than that, because some ideas are right and still fail. Not because they're false, not because they're harmful, but because they arrive before the world knows how to receive them. Timing is the invisible force we rarely talk about. An idea doesn't enter an empty space, it enters a culture. And cultures have moods, limits, thresholds of tolerance. An idea can be correct and still feel threatening. It can be accurate and still feel absurd, because truth alone doesn't decide survival. Readiness does. Think about how often people say, "That idea was ahead of its time." That sentence sounds like praise, but what it really means is this: the idea was true in the wrong moment. When an idea arrives too early, it doesn't sound visionary. It sounds disconnected, unrealistic, dangerous, out of touch. Not because of its content, but because it violates the emotional limits of the time it enters. Every society carries unspoken boundaries. What can be questioned, what must remain fixed, what feels negotiable, and what feels sacred. Ideas that cross those boundaries don't get evaluated calmly. They get rejected instinctively, not debated, dismissed. This is where timing becomes more powerful than truth. An idea needs social momentum the same way a seed needs soil. Without it, even the strongest idea cannot take root. So, ideas wait. They disappear from public conversation, from public memory, not because they died, but because they went dormant. They hibernate, waiting for language to catch up, for tools to emerge, for fear to loosen its grip. And when conditions finally change, the same idea reappears, suddenly obvious, suddenly inevitable. This is why history looks strange in hindsight. We look back and ask, how did people not see this? But people didn't fail to see. They failed to feel ready. Readiness isn't intellectual, it's emotional. It's about whether a society can absorb the consequences of an idea without falling apart. Alchemy itself lived in this space. Its core intuition that matter and reality could transform wasn't wrong. It was early. The language was symbolic because literal language didn't exist yet. The tools weren't ready. The culture wasn't ready. So the idea waited. Centuries later, that same intuition reappeared with equations and laboratories, and suddenly it wasn't nonsense anymore. That's the quiet cruelty of timing. Truth doesn't announce itself politely. It arrives when it arrives. And whether it survives has less to do with accuracy and more to do with whether the world can afford to hear it. Truth without timing doesn't look like wisdom. It looks like madness. And that realization changes how you judge failure, because sometimes an idea doesn't lose. It just arrives before its moment. Next, we move deeper into that idea, because if failure isn't final and timing shapes survival, then what role does failure actually play? Failure carries a strange kind of shame. We treat it as a verdict, a full stop, a signal that something should not be continued. But that idea collapses the moment you look honestly at how progress actually unfolds. Because progress is rarely built by ideas that arrive fully formed. It is built by ideas that don't work, at least not at first. Wrong ideas, incomplete ideas, ideas that fail publicly, repeatedly, and awkwardly. And yet, those are the ideas that move things forward. Failure doesn't vanish when an attempt collapses. It leaves traces behind. Methods get refined. Questions become sharper. Boundaries are discovered. Every failed attempt changes the terrain slightly, even if nothing visible improves right away. That's why failure isn't empty. It's cumulative. It stacks quietly beneath success like invisible scaffolding. Alchemy is often used as the example of failure, a centuries-long mistake, a misguided obsession. But that story only works if you define failure as wasted effort. Alchemy failed to do what it promised, but in the process of failing, it changed how humans interacted with the unknown. It normalized experimentation. It taught careful observation. It created spaces, physical and mental, where trial and error were allowed. That was new. Before alchemy, knowledge was something inherited. After alchemy, knowledge became something tested. Chemistry didn't emerge despite alchemy. It emerged through it. Failure built the infrastructure that success later stood on. Progress rarely moves forward cleanly. It hesitates. It circles back. It repeats mistakes in slightly better ways. Each failure answers one quiet question: not this way. And that answer matters, because knowing what doesn't work is often more valuable than guessing what might. Over time, those answers accumulate. They narrow the field. They sharpen direction, until what once felt impossible starts to feel inevitable. This is why judging ideas solely by immediate success is deeply misleading. An idea can fail and still be essential. An idea can be wrong in execution, but right in spirit. Most ideas that eventually reshape the world arrive as drafts. Rough, clumsy, unconvincing. They don't disappear because they fail. They evolve because they fail. When you zoom out far enough, progress doesn't look heroic. It looks iterative. It looks like learning. Failure is not the opposite of progress. Failure is progress trying to understand itself. It's feedback, not defeat. Each failed attempt clarifies the next move. Each collapse carries information forward. The only true waste is stopping. This reframing changes something important. Because once failure stops looking like an ending, fear loses its power. If failure is part of the engine, then risk becomes necessary. Avoiding failure doesn't protect progress. It suffocates it. Alchemy didn't fail. It taught humanity how to fail productively, how to experiment without guarantees, how to continue without certainty, how to treat mistakes as information. That lesson never disappeared. It simply changed names. And it's still powering the world, quietly, invisibly, beneath every success we celebrate. Next, we step into a harder question. If failure is necessary and timing determines survival, then who decides which ideas are allowed to keep failing and which ones are shut down? There's a question we almost never ask. Not because it's difficult, but because it's uncomfortable. Who decides what makes sense? We're taught to believe that rationality is neutral, that ideas rise or fall on logic alone, that the best argument wins. But the more I paid attention, the harder that story was to maintain. Because ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They exist inside systems. Every society depends on stability, predictable roles, reliable rules, shared assumptions that keep things functioning. Institutions form to protect that stability. Governance, academia, markets, cultural authorities. And once stability becomes the priority, anything that threatens it starts to feel dangerous. Not wrong, dangerous. That's where labels appear. Crazy, unrealistic, irresponsible, dangerous. Those words sound descriptive. They're not. They're defensive. Most disruptive ideas are not rejected with evidence. They're rejected with tone. A raised eyebrow, a laugh, a quiet dismissal. The message is subtle but clear. We don't do that kind of thinking here. And the person hearing it learns something important. Not about truth, but about boundaries. Power doesn't usually silence ideas directly. It frames them. It decides which questions are respectable and which ones are embarrassing, which ideas are debated seriously and which ones are joked about. Once an idea is labeled irrational, it doesn't need to be disproven. It simply stops being heard. This is why sense is rarely just logical. It's social. What makes sense today is often what doesn't threaten existing structures. What feels rational is often what keeps power where it is. That doesn't mean authority is malicious. Stability is genuinely valuable. But it does mean that rationality is never as neutral as we pretend. History quietly confirms this. Ideas don't become sensible the moment they become true. They become sensible when they stop threatening the order of things. Before that, they're framed as naive, or reckless, or dangerous to social cohesion. And the people who hold them are treated accordingly. This reframing changes how you see disagreement. Sometimes resistance has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with consequence. If an idea forces institutions to reorganize, it will be resisted, even if it's correct. Because accepting it would require admitting that the rules themselves need to change. And changing rules is expensive. This is why progress feels slow. Not because truth is weak, but because systems are heavy. They don't turn easily. They don't move because an argument is elegant. They move when pressure becomes unavoidable. Once you see this, the phrase, "that doesn't make sense," sounds different. It often means, "that idea doesn't fit here. That idea threatens something important. That idea arrives before we're ready to absorb its consequences." And that realization is sobering, because it means rationality is partly negotiated. Sense, then, is not purely logical. It's shaped by power, protected by institutions, and enforced through social cues. And once you understand that, you stop mistaking rejection for refutation. You start asking a better question. Not, "is this idea wrong?" but, "who does this idea disturb?" That awareness changes how you listen. It slows judgment. It adds context to resistance. And it prepares you for the next, deeper issue. Because if authority shapes sense, and belief shapes action, then why do humans cling so tightly to certainty, even when it limits them? There's a feeling we rarely question because it feels too good to doubt. Certainty. It feels like standing on solid ground, like clarity, like intelligence. But the longer I sat with everything we'd uncovered, the more certainty started to look suspicious. Because certainty isn't just a belief, it's a sensation. And sensations can be addictive. Certainty feels safe. It closes questions, ends discomfort, gives the mind a place to rest. When you're certain, you don't have to keep thinking. You don't have to tolerate ambiguity. You don't have to sit with tension. The world feels smaller, but calmer. And the brain loves that. Ambiguity, on the other hand, feels like exposure. It forces the mind to stay alert, to admit ignorance, to hold multiple possibilities at once. That's exhausting. So the brain looks for shortcuts, simple answers, clean explanations, clear sides. Even when those explanations are wrong, they feel better than uncertainty. This is how false clarity spreads, not because it's convincing, but because it's comforting. Certainty offers relief. It tells you you're done thinking, you're safe now, you don't need to look further. Growth doesn't offer that. Growth offers questions. This is why people defend beliefs long after evidence shifts. Letting go of certainty feels like stepping into open space without knowing where the ground is. So we cling to ideologies, to identities, to explanations that no longer fit, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. Certainty becomes a shelter, and shelters are hard to leave once you've built your life inside them. The cost of this addiction is subtle. Certainty doesn't stop movement all at once, it slows it. It narrows curiosity, reduces exploration, turns questions into threats. When certainty dominates, new ideas don't feel interesting, they feel irritating. This is why societies with strong certainty often stagnate, not because they lack intelligence, but because they've decided they already know enough. Certainty freezes the frame. Everything outside it looks unnecessary, wrong, or dangerous. Alchemy understood something here that we still struggle to accept. Transformation requires uncertainty. Before something becomes clear, it must first become unclear. Before something reorganizes, it must loosen. Certainty resists that loosening. It holds things in place. This reframes intelligence entirely. Intelligence is not the ability to reach conclusions quickly. It's the ability to stay open longer than is comfortable, to tolerate ambiguity without rushing to closure. That's rare, because certainty feels good. But comfort is not growth. Certainty comforts, but it confines. It builds walls where doors are needed. It offers answers where questions are required. And once you see certainty as a habit, not a virtue, you start noticing how often it appears right before curiosity disappears. The challenge, then, is not to eliminate certainty. It's to loosen its grip, to recognize when clarity is genuine and when it's just relief. Because the future has never been built by people who were completely certain. It has always been built by those willing to remain unsure just a little longer. And that brings us inward, because certainty doesn't just shape societies, it shapes identity. And when certainty cracks inside a person, something deeper begins to happen. Real transformation does not begin with improvement. It begins with disruption. Something stops working. A belief loses its grip. An identity that once felt stable begins to feel tight. At first, this feels like failure, but it isn't. It is the beginning of inner alchemy. Alchemy was never only concerned with metals. Its stages, dissolution, separation, and purification, were descriptions of how change actually happens. Not externally, internally. Before anything new can be formed, something old must break down. This is the part most people misunderstand. They expect growth to feel additive, like gaining strength, clarity, confidence. But real change feels subtractive. Certainty dissolves. Old explanations lose authority. Familiar reactions stop satisfying. Identity begins to soften. And softness feels dangerous to a mind that craves structure. Breakdown is not a detour on the path of growth. It is the path. Before rebuilding can occur, the existing structure must loosen. Roles you played automatically, stories you repeated for stability, beliefs you inherited without examination. They do not disappear gently. They resist. This resistance is often mistaken for something going wrong. Anxiety, confusion, loss of direction. But in alchemical terms, this is dissolution, the moment when form gives way so transformation can begin. Inner alchemy does not announce itself with clarity. It begins with disorientation. You no longer know exactly who you are, but you know who you are not. You no longer trust old answers, but new ones have not yet formed. This in-between state feels uncomfortable because certainty has been removed. And certainty, as we've seen, is deeply comforting. Most people rush to escape this phase. They rebuild the old identity quickly, not because it was true, but because it was familiar. This is why change often stalls. Not because transformation is impossible, but because dissolution is misunderstood. Alchemy understood something crucial. Transformation destroys before it creates. You cannot stack a new self on top of an old one. You must melt what exists until something else can emerge. That process is slow, unclear, unrewarded by immediate results, but it is necessary. Growth, then, is not about becoming more. It is about becoming less of what no longer fits. Less certainty, less rigidity, less attachment to outdated stories. What remains is not emptiness. It is possibility. Inner alchemy requires patience, the willingness to stay in uncertainty without forcing resolution, to allow identity to loosen without immediately replacing it, to trust that breakdown is not destruction, but preparation. Every meaningful transformation follows this pattern, in individuals, in ideas, in civilizations. First, the structure cracks, then it dissolves. Only later does something new take shape. Transformation does not polish the old, it melts it. And what emerges afterward is never an improved version of the past, but something genuinely new. With that understanding, change stops feeling like failure. It starts to feel like evolution. And once the inner world begins to shift, the outer world reveals something equally strange. Much of reality itself is held together by agreements we never consciously chose. That is where we go next. Most of what shapes daily life is never questioned, not because it is obviously true, but because it works. Money, status, identity. They feel solid, objective, almost physical. But none of them exist the way mountains do. They exist because we agree they do. Money is not valuable by nature. It has no inherent power, no physical necessity. It works because millions of people accept the same story at the same time. Paper becomes wealth. Numbers become trust. Symbols become survival. The moment belief disappears, money stops functioning, not slowly, immediately. That fragility reveals something important. Money is not a physical system. It is an agreement. Status works the same way. No one can touch status. No one can measure it directly. Yet it shapes behavior, opportunity, and access. People defer, compete, obey, not because status is real in a material sense, but because the story surrounding it is widely accepted. Once belief shifts, status dissolves. Titles lose authority. Reputation fades. Hierarchy rearranges. Status is maintained by collective recognition, nothing more. Identity feels more personal, more intimate, but it follows the same structure. We tell stories about who we are, repeat them, defend them. I am this kind of person. I don't do that. This is just how I am. Those stories create continuity. They make behavior predictable. They stabilize the self. But they are not fixed truths. They are maintained narratives. The moment belief loosens, identity becomes negotiable. And that realization can feel unsettling. Society functions because these agreements remain invisible. We don't wake up each morning and renegotiate money, status, or identity. We inherit them. We step into systems already stabilized by belief. That efficiency keeps the world running. But it also hides how fragile those structures actually are. When belief shifts collectively, entire realities reorganize, markets collapse, institutions lose legitimacy, identities realign. Not because physical laws changed, but because agreements did. This is why revolutions are rarely technical. They are narrative events. Stories change first, systems follow. Once you see this pattern, the world looks different, less rigid, less inevitable, more constructed. That doesn't make reality fake. It makes it negotiated. Society is not held together by physics alone. It is held together by belief contracts, shared understandings that feel natural only because they are widely repeated. This explains why change feels threatening. To challenge an agreement is to destabilize a shared story, and shared stories provide safety. They reduce uncertainty, they coordinate behavior, so they are protected, sometimes fiercely. Understanding invisible agreements doesn't mean rejecting them. It means seeing them clearly, seeing that they persist not because they are eternal, but because belief continues to support them. And belief, as we've seen, is never permanent. Once that awareness settles in, a new responsibility appears. If reality is partially constructed by belief, then how we relate to strange ideas matters. Which brings us to the final discipline. Not belief, not rejection, but something quieter. There is a kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to win. It waits. Most of us are trained to respond quickly, to hear an idea and immediately decide what it is. True or false, smart or stupid, safe or dangerous. That speed feels competent. It feels like control. But speed is often just discomfort escaping through judgment. Uncertainty creates tension. It leaves the mind without footing, without resolution. And the mind hates that, so it grabs the nearest explanation and calls it truth, even when that explanation is thin, even when it collapses later. False clarity feels better than honest uncertainty. Holding the impossible is the refusal to relieve that tension too quickly. It is the ability to encounter an idea that feels strange, unfinished, or unsettling and say, not yet. Not belief, not rejection, suspension. This posture is uncomfortable because it removes identity protection. If you don't decide quickly, you can't anchor yourself to a position. You can't say, I am the kind of person who believes this, or I am the kind of person who rejects that. You remain exposed, and exposure feels unsafe. But this is where understanding grows. Not in certainty, but in patience. Ideas need space. They need time to reveal their structure, their implications, their weaknesses. Rushing to judgment interrupts that process. Not believing too fast protects you from self-deception. Not rejecting too fast protects you from blindness. Both mistakes come from the same urge, the desire to feel settled. But insight rarely arrives settled. It arrives tentatively. This is why breakthroughs are rarely recognized by the loudest voices. They are recognized by those who can tolerate confusion longer than others. Those who can sit with contradiction without demanding immediate resolution. Those who allow ideas to remain unfinished while they mature. Living with uncertainty without panic is not weakness. It is discipline. It requires strength to stay open when the mind is begging for closure. But openness is not empty. It is fertile. It allows unexpected connections, unseen patterns, new frames of understanding. Alchemy was never about certainty. It was about endurance. The endurance to hold the impossible without collapsing into fantasy or retreating into dismissal. Not declaring that lead is gold, not declaring that transformation is impossible. Remaining in the tension. That posture, more than any experiment, was its real achievement. Intelligence, then, is not the speed of conclusion. It is the capacity to remain open without fragmenting, to live inside questions without rushing them toward answers. The future does not belong to the most confident. It belongs to the most patient. Holding the impossible does not guarantee truth, but it creates the only environment in which truth can surface without distortion. In a world built on belief, timing, and invisible agreements, the ability to stay open longer may be the rarest form of wisdom. One chapter remains, not to add more knowledge, but to reframe everything that came before it. Because the greatest misunderstanding about alchemy was never about gold. Alchemy is usually remembered for what it failed to do. No gold, no immortality, no miracle transformations. But that memory misses what alchemy was actually training. It was not training chemistry. It was training imagination. Alchemy taught humanity to take transformation seriously before it could be proven, to sit with impossible ideas long enough for new ways of seeing to emerge. Not because the ideas were correct, but because they kept possibility alive. In that sense, alchemy succeeded, not in results, in posture. It created a habit of mind that refused to treat reality as finished. It taught people to ask not only what is, but what else could be. History quietly depends on that habit. Every major shift begins as something that sounds wrong, unrealistic, naive. Not because it is false, but because it does not yet fit inside the current story of how the world works. The ideas that shape the future rarely arrive in respectable forms. They arrive clumsy, unclear, unconvincing. They sound like nonsense, until they don't. Alchemy's greatest contribution was not a substance, it was permission. permission to imagine transformation without waiting for certainty, permission to hold strange ideas without immediate dismissal, permission to treat reality as something still in motion. That permission never disappeared. It moved quietly into science, into psychology, into innovation, into every place where someone refuses to accept that things are finished. And now it moves into the reader, not as a belief to adopt, not as a conclusion to defend, but as a posture, a willingness to sit with ideas that do not yet make sense, to notice discomfort without obeying it, to treat uncertainty as a sign of potential rather than failure. Gold was never the goal. Gold was a symbol, a stand-in for something deeper. The belief that transformation is possible even when the method is unclear. The experiment never ended, it only changed language. It continues every time someone holds an impossible idea a little longer instead of laughing it away. It continues every time certainty loosens just enough for something new to form. There is no final answer here, no conclusion to rest on, only a quiet invitation to notice what feels impossible, to notice what feels wrong too quickly, to notice what the world has not yet made room for. Because the world is not finished. It is still becoming. And so are you. And that's it for today, my friend. You were listening to Wise Alchemy. The story ends here for now, but you and I will meet again. Thank you.